Okay, good evening. This is Thomas Freed on the Liberty Works Radio Network. This is the Truth Attack Hour, and yes, that's right. We're back with the Truth Attack. Okay, let's get right into this because I got a number of things I want to chat about this evening. I'm not sure if we'll get to them all, but we are the Liberty Works Radio Network, and we do need the support of the members of the listening audience to keep the broadcast network operating and the shows coming. So if you enjoy the information, the shows, the lectures, the topics, and the discussions, and the hosts and guests on the other shows in the network, we sure would appreciate it if you could find your way over to the LibertyWorksRadioNetwork.com website and get signed up as a subscribing member, even if it's as little as just $10, $20 a month. Every membership helps, and we do need your support to keep the network operating. And if you want to get fully informed on the coming collapse of the federal income tax and the IRS, you need to find your way over to tax-freedom.com and read the SCOTUS article and the Broken Tax System article that are posted there that tells you about what has developed in the last year concerning the exposing of the fraudulent, unconstitutional IRS enforcement of the federal income tax as a direct tax on all earnings rather than an indirect tax, which is only imposed on certain transactions and activities subject to taxation by impost, foreign taxation, duty, export taxation, and excise, commodities, licenses, and corporations. There is no taxation of labor under Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1. It's not one of the activities subject to federal tax. When the court says it's not the non-apportioned direct tax that the IRS has been enforcing, that the government has been arguing in court, and that the judges have been upholding since basically 1955, the court says it's not the direct tax they've been enforcing. It's not based on earning money in the 50 states. It's based on Article 1, Section 8, the power to tax by impost, duty, and excise, where income is neither the subject of the tax nor the object of the taxation. It's the yardstick that measures the amount of tax owed on the federally taxable earnings derived from the activity or transactions subject to indirect taxation under Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1, by impost, duty, or excise. There's no direct non-apportioned tax. It doesn't exist. It's been a 60-year constitutional fraud that's been perpetrated by the United States government, which has been enforcing not any constitutional taxation, but the second plank of the Communist Manifesto, which reads a heavy, progressive, or graduated income tax. And that's where you find the class legislation of graduated taxation that divides the people into different classes and then writes different law for each class, setting the classes at war with one another in what can only be described as a system of class warfare and usurpation of authority by the federal government, which is constantly stepping in to allegedly settle the class warfare it engineered in order to steal more power. Because, of course, in a class warfare system, both sides of each class are constantly calling for the government to step in and assume more authority and write more law to end the class warfare. Tax the rich, don't tax the poor. The rich already pay. Everyone should contribute. It's all communism, people. Got nothing to do with uniform indirect taxation of foreign activity, foreign persons, foreign imports, and in foreign places by impost, the taxation of exported goods by duty, and the taxation of commodities like alcohol, tobacco, firearms, certain licenses to pursue certain occupations like a license to sell alcohol, tobacco, and firearms, and the corporate privilege, where it is the privilege that is the subject of the tax, not the earning of money. And citizens don't earn money through a privilege of incorporation. They earn money in the 50 states through the exercise of the right to work. And rights aren't taxable, neither the possession of the right beforehand, nor the exercise of it after the fact. There is no constitutional authority to tax the labors of the American people. There never was. There never has been. It's been a constitutional fraud since the victory tax in World War II. And when that tax expired, they just continued a system of withholding and collection by allowance without any tax ever being imposed. And then through propaganda and extortion and criminal and unlawful, unconstitutional prosecution of citizens for 60 years, they drove everyone into subserviently and obediently practicing that second plank and giving up their rights to property, to freedom, to liberty, to pursue occupations, common occupations, without use or benefit of any privilege, federally granted privilege or benefit, or federal privilege or license. Citizens earn money by right. The Supreme Court's decision in Moore plainly and clearly says income taxes are indirect taxes, and it makes the 16th Amendment part of the foundation, part of that indirect foundation. The 16th Amendment did not create a new power to tax directly and without limitation. It did not create a scenario where your earnings are now gross income because they're deemed taxable compensation under Section 61. That was all done through judicial legislation. There's no law that taxes the wages and salaries of the American people, only the non-resident alien. That law is Section 1441B in Title 26. Go look it up if you don't believe me. And go over to Section 61 and tell me where the words salaries and wages appear in that code section. It isn't there because there's no tax on your labor. The tax is imposed on the foreigner's work. It was a Tariff Act, the Underwood-Simmons Tariff Act of October 3rd, 1913. That's the original legislation that created the withholding from foreigners. But there was no withholding from citizens until World War II and the victory tax. And Section 61 wasn't even part of that original legislation. Where did it come from? It came 5 years later under another piece of foreign legislation, the Canadian Tax Treaty that lasted for 75 years, from 1918, when it was initiated, to 1993, when it expired and was replaced with NAFTA by Bill Clinton. No more taxation. Section 61 is technically dead letter law because the original legislation it was enacted under has expired, and it was never enacted by Congress with a greater applicability at law than that which was provided by the original legislation, i.e. the tax treaty with Canada, where American citizens living and working in Canada, or going over the border daily to work in Canada, were taxed on their salaries and wages and compensation. Under the treaty, they were taxed on that money earned in Canada. They weren't taxed on those earnings in the United States. And it was only through the tax treaty that the U.S. government got the power to tax Americans' labor in Canada. Since that treaty has expired, people working in Canada have no duty whatsoever to report or pay tax on those foreign earnings. The federal government has no authority whatsoever to tax the earnings of the American people when earned outside of the territorial or treaty jurisdictions of the federal government. They got no authority to tax in China or Russia or any country where there's no treaty. They don't own you. You're not their slave. You don't owe them a piece of everything you do in the rest of the world. That's the King of England owning you. That's the system we threw away in 1776. It's not the system we adopted in 1945. The whole thing's been a fraud. One huge, monumental, constitutional fraud. And if you want to get informed on it and learn how to stop being a slave to the federal government and a peon for the Federal Reserve Bank, doing nothing but servicing their debt, because none of the money withheld from your work, your pay at work, or that you send in on April 15th with your return, none of that money goes to the Federal Reserve Bank. None of that money goes to the Treasury. It all goes directly to the Federal Reserve Bank to service the $36 trillion in debt owed by Congress to the bankers who have used the population of America to collateralize the $36 trillion in debt owed to them. And as long as they see the population of America being willing to let themselves be used in that manner as the collateral for the $36 trillion in debt, you will get nothing but more debt. Nothing but more debt. As long as they see you willing to play the role of the serf, the peon, and the slave, they will continue to take advantage of the stupidity of Congress, who is running it out and taking the currency into oblivion, which is bad news for America and the American people, because as goes the currency, so goes the fate of the nation and the quality of life of its people. So either we get the debt under control and compel the government to start living within its budget, its means, the revenues raised, or they are going to run it out and destroy the currency and send America back into the Stone Ages, literally the Depression, where there is no currency left to exchange. Everyone has to go begging to the government for food, shelter, housing, clothing, transportation, work, employment, literally life sustenance. So it's a good thing what Elon Musk is doing and going after the waste and fraud and exposing this. And even if it amounts only to smaller numbers than they claim, it's the kind of conscious effort we need to be engaged in with every administration from here on out to shut down the spending that won't be productive for America and which only subsidizes an adversarial political agenda that opposes the freedom of the people and the restricted, limited form of representative government put in place by the Constitution. Because, of course, what the Democrats want is an unlimited power in government. They want to be able to rule every single aspect of society: agriculture, energy, education, transportation, housing, commerce, labor, healthcare, environmental protection, occupational studies. None of these things are in the Constitution. None of them are activities that the federal government is authorized to be involved with. And they should all be terminated as soon as possible. And that takes us, I think, to our next topic, which is the Schumer shutdown. That's coming up here, because the Republican House has passed a bill to fund the government, but they need to get 60 votes in the Senate to get it through, and Schumer doesn't want to support it. And so far, the only Democrat that's come across the board is John Fetterman. Wouldn't you know it? The only intelligent, rational Democrat left in the party is the one who was mentally diminished in capacity when he took office. But I have to admit that he seems to overcome that. He's the only person in the Democrat Party who sounds like an American anymore. It's just mind-boggling how far off the edge the Democrat Party has gone. It's completely demolished. It's no longer the Democrat Party. It's being led by Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, and AOC. They're ignoring Fetterman, who's out there all by himself in the middle. It's turned into the Democrat Socialist Party. It's turned into the Socialist Party of America. It's not the Democrat Party anymore. And the old Democrats, people like Trump and Musk, have moved to Republican, because the Republicans are a lot closer to the center now than the Democrats have been for 12 years. 16 years? They kind of left the farm and went into orbit during Obama with insane attention to just nutty things. Okay, I think I hear the first commercial break coming up. So this is Thomas Freed on the Liberty Works Radio Network. I encourage you to find your way over to tax-freedom.com and start reading to get informed on the changes that are coming. From Okay, this is Thomas Freed on the Liberty Works Radio Network. We are back, and I'm going to get right back into this. When the commercial break came up, I was talking about the Schumer shutdown, which is threatened now because the Congress needs to pass a budget. And the Republican Congress passed it, handed it over to the Senate. All the Republican senators, for the most part, are on board, but they need 7 or 8 Democrats to come across the table and fund the operation of the government so it continue to stay open. And Schumer is orchestrating the Democratic Party, the senators in the Senate, the Democratic senators, to oppose the bill, which means that if the government shuts down, which the Democrats are always yelling and screaming shouldn't have happened, it will be the fault of the Democrats in Senate. And if Schumer wants to shut down the government, I say, let's take him up on it. Let's shut down the government and use that opportunity to close and get rid of completely, not just half the Department of Education, but the rest of it, with the Department of Agriculture, the Department of Commerce, the Department of Labor, most of Health and Human Services. We'll leave Medicare and Medicaid in place for now. Get rid of the rest of it. Let's get rid of HUD, housing, transportation, energy, education, environmental protection, occupational safety. None of these things were ever supposed to be federal activities. They're supposed to be state. So let's shut the government down, get rid of all these departments, and that'll save $1.4 trillion in the federal budget. But I'm not proposing we just cut that out, because that would create an economic shock to the country and drive us into a recession. Instead, what we should do is use that money to stimulate an economic boom by taking it away from the central planners in Washington, D.C., cutting it by 10% across the board every year until the budget is balanced, while we cut the rest of the federal budget 5% every year, and distribute those unauthorized agency funds to the state governments, proportionate to their share of the census, the population under the census, and let the states have the access to $1.3 trillion to spend on education, housing, interior, agriculture, energy, labor, healthcare, environmental protection, occupational safety. Let's let the states manage this. Let's, as I say, share the wealth, and let the states have some access to that unlimited capital at the Federal Reserve Bank that has allowed the government to usurp all of these areas and build this huge bureaucratic nightmare that runs the entire country with central planning from Washington, D.C., when it has no idea at all what it's doing other than stealing power. Because it's not running the country for the country. It's running the country for the bureaucrats in Washington, D.C. That's what regulatory deference under Chevron was all about. Letting the social bureaucracy, the huge, enormous departments bureaucracy, the unauthorized agencies bureaucracies, literally write their own laws. Not just for the federal government, but for the whole country. The drainage ditches, the flood ponds. Oh no, they're now under EPA control. It's just all unconstitutional, and we should take them up on it. Close the government, Chucky. Go ahead. Close the government down on Friday, and let's watch Trump close all these agencies and fire half the people in every single one of these just to get started. Because this is how you transfer power from the federal government to the states. You eliminate the federal bureaucracy, and you send the money that you've been spending in Washington, D.C. on that bureaucracy, you send it to the states. And that way, the state capitals can distribute the funds in their state to deal with transportation and roads and education and teachers and schools, instead of critical race theory and gender dysmorphia and new math as the mandated curriculum to get federal funds. All of that central planning's got to get tossed. You need a competition between the 50 states to see which systems work best and which demographics and which systems don't work at all. And the one that doesn't work at all is the one that's in place now. In energy, agriculture, education, healthcare, housing, transportation. It isn't working anywhere, is it? So that's because it's the federal government has reached the dysfunctional state of its evolution, where it's become so large it's no longer able to function. It's a monolith. And the only thing it does is oppress the individual and destroy their rights as the central bureaucracy assumes ever more power. So it's time to cut it down. Eliminate all of the unauthorized, unconstitutional spending and activity. That's the only way to save the currency. Elon Musk is right. You either get rid of this waste and overspending and get back living within your means, or you are going to destroy the currency. This country existed for 210 years. 210 years. 1788 to 1988, 200 years, and it had $3 trillion in debt when Reagan left office. He actually tripled it. You had $1 trillion in 1980. The Reagan miracle was tripling the debt to bankrupt the Soviet Union, trying to keep up. And it didn't really hurt us because it turned out the expansion of capital was okay. You had a lot of stuff coming that used the capital. Anyway, you had $1 trillion in the first 200 years, $3 trillion in the first 200, $1 trillion in the first 190. And since 1980, in 45 years, compared to the $1 trillion you had in 1980, you've run up 35 trillion more. 35 trillion in 35 years. 1 trillion in the first 200. 35 trillion cents. Put it on a graph. If you don't get what the graph means, go over to taxfreedom.com, check it out. I graphed it for you and I explain on it what it means. It means you're going to hell. Your currency is going to oblivion and the quality of life is going to hell. Because that's what happens when you incinerate a currency by running it out. So if Chucky Boy really wants to shut down the government, let's do it. Let's shut down the government, eliminate the unconstitutional agencies, and transfer the budget to the state capitals so that 50 state capitals can spend the money in their state to fix the situation and the infrastructure in their state by contractors and jobs in their state. Instead of all the money going to the international conglomerates that win the contracts coming out of DC because they control the lobby. And the small state companies get nothing, when they should be the ones getting all the money. If this 50 state capitals were allowed to distribute 1.2 trillion in spending within their own states, you generate a jobs boom, an economic boom, and an economic recovery unlike anything seen before, all while balancing the budget, making the government smaller and putting it back into the representative box of limited powers instead of the ruling throne of unlimited omnipotence it now assumes in operation everywhere, which is particularly emphasized in the courts, isn't it? Because if you want to try and keep your own money, they call you a criminal. Yeah, the whole tax system is what's criminal. It's criminally communistic, based on the second plank of the Communist Manifesto. It's got nothing to do with constitutional taxation. So that's what I think. You need to go ahead and shut it on down to escape what we're looking at under this huge regulatory bureaucracy, which gives us an Orwellian future under the current peonage system of medieval past, all at the same time. There's some irony for you, right? You're looking at an Orwellian future while living a medieval past of peonage debt service. It's the 11th century peonage plantation with electrical amenities. But there's no freedom. And the Democratic Socialist Party isn't working for America. It's working for a one-world government, a one-world socialism that gets rid of the national governments that are in the way of the multinational corporate conglomerates utilizing, stealing natural resources in underdeveloped worlds, producing enslaved population states, and selling at best prices into the wealthy Western markets. That's what's really motivating the Democrat Party, is let's take over everything. And on the upside, inflation is finally breaking. Under Donald Trump in the last month, the inflation numbers are less than 3% for the first time in what, 3.5 years? I say we're turning the corner. The price of oil is down 3 weeks in a row. And this is really the key to whether or not we will have a strong economic recovery or if we'll roll along here on the verge of a recession, which is where Joe Biden took us. And has actually had us. I told you 3 years ago that you're in a recession when you had the 2 down quarters and Biden sent out Binder, Karine Jean-Pierre, to tell you that it's not a recession, we're redefining it. Yeah, right, babe, right. Check. And then they spent $3 trillion to prop it all up. Government printing money and spending isn't economic recovery. It's panic. We've been in a recession for 3 years and it could have rolled over and gotten worse. But with oil coming down and prices coming down and a new direction being implemented by Donald Trump, we're going to, the cost of oil can be brought down. We will have an economic recovery. If you can do anything like what I'm talking about at cutting the federal government, distributing the funds to the states, you'll have an economic boom. And without that, you'll have continued slow roll of the moribund federal funding, which spent in the right direction will move things forward, but not as quickly as if you gave the money to the states to spend in the states. That's the quickest way to an economic boom and economic recovery that this nation could come up with. So, yeah, that's where you got to go. And Musk is right about cutting the waste, fraud, and abuse. And we need to expose the fact that none of this federal funding is constitutionally authorized. It needs to all be shut down to get the government back into the box, because as long as they're allowed to spend outside of the constitutional authority, there will always be, not the possibility, but the real threat of when the Democrats take power, they bring it all back. Try to do the same thing all over again. People need to wake up and discover and find out there's no constitutional authority for none of these agencies. They were all created the whim of the president during an artificial crisis. Energy and education were, I believe, under Carter in the late 70s. Agriculture was in the 30s under the Depression, created by the government allowing the Federal Reserve Bank to control the money supply. So all of these unconstitutional agencies came about at periods of time and conflict in the United States when it was deemed necessary, but it wasn't constitutionally authorized. So they just broke the law to do what they wanted to do. And then it never got undone because, of course, everything Congress does in law never gets undone. It just goes on forever. They still have laws on the books that make it illegal to whip your horse with a buggy whip on Sunday in front of the church. Right, check. Okay, so, they're announcing now, the Republicans, that they want to go after the fraud that occurred under the COVID bills that let people claim money for keeping people employed. And of course, how many billions went fraudulently out the door on that? And the Democrats are opposing it. Now, can anybody think of a reason why the Democrats would oppose going after the COVID fraudsters? Let's see. You think maybe it's because they were the fraudsters? They were the ones doing it? The Democrats? Could that be why they don't want anyone to go after the fraudsters? It's probably the same story with Epstein's list. They don't want that released either because their names are on the list. Of course they don't want it exposed. They're the ones who've been corrupting the law, violating it, breaking it, working to enslave the American people to foreign interests, rather than working to free them to be as productive as possible without federal interference or taxation, diminishing those efforts. Okay, I think I hear the second commercial break coming up. This is Thomas Freed on the Liberty Works Radio Network. This is the Truth Attack Hour, and when we come back, I think we're going to take a look at what the Supreme Court has actually said about the federal income tax through the years so that we can identify how off track the IRS, the DOJ, and the federal courts have been for 50 years. This is Okay, this is Thomas Freed on the Liberty Works Radio Network. Let's just get right into this. I said I was going to visit what the Supreme Court has historically said about income taxes and taxation in general, both direct and indirect. It's fully discussed and examined in this. And how this historical application by the Supreme Court has been completely ignored and functionally reversed by the rebellious and insurrectionist circuit courts, which have all ruled and have been enforcing for the last 45 years the income tax as though it were a non-apportioned, unlimited, direct tax on all earnings authorized under the 16th Amendment without limitation. It's a direct tax on everything you do because of the 16th Amendment. And they've had to argue this because there is no taxation of labor under Article 1, Section 8. So in order to get to an argument that they could say allowed them to tax your work, salaries, wages, and labor directly, they had to argue it was the 16th Amendment, which is communism, not constitutional taxation. Want proof? Well, let's read what the Supreme Court said. The subject matter of taxation open to the power of the Congress is as comprehensive as that open to the power of the states, though the method of apportionment may at times be different. Quote, the Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises, close quote. Article 1, Section 8. If the tax is a direct one, it shall be apportioned according to the census or enumeration. If it is a duty, impost, or excise, an indirect tax, it shall be uniform throughout the United States. Together, these classes include every form of tax appropriate to sovereignty. This cites Burnett v. Brooks, Bruce Shaber, and Stewart Machine is where the quote comes from, 1937. Direct taxes are apportioned, indirect taxes are uniform. Next, this is talking about the corporate income tax. The tax, being an excise, its imposition must conform to the canon of uniformity. There has been no departure from this requirement. According to the settled doctrine, the uniformity exacted is geographical, not intrinsic. It cites Knowlton v. Moore, Flint v. Stone Tracy, Billings v. U.S., LaBelle Iron Works, Poe v. Seaburn, Wright v. Vinton, and Stewart Machine. Next, duties and imposts are terms commonly applied to levies made by governments on the importation or exportation of commodities. Excises are taxes laid upon the manufacture, sale, or consumption of commodities within the country, upon licenses to pursue certain occupations, and upon corporate privileges. The requirement to pay such taxes involves the exercise of the privilege. And if the business is not done in the manner described, no tax is payable. It is the privilege which is the subject of the tax and not the mere buying, selling, or handling of goods. It cites Flint v. Stone Tracy and Cooley, Constitutional Limitations, 7th edition, 680. Okay, by the previous ruling, which was Bershaber, this is from Stanton v. Baltic Mining in 1913, one of the original Supreme Court decisions on the constitutionality of the federal income tax. By the previous ruling, it was settled that the provisions of the 16th Amendment conferred no new power of taxation, but simply prohibited the previous complete and plenary power of income taxation possessed by Congress from the beginning from being taken out of the category of indirect taxation to which it inherently belonged. Income is indirect. It's the yardstick for measuring the amount of the impost due to the excise. It's not a new power, neither to tax directly without limitation, nor to tax under a fourth power of indirect taxation labeled income. No new powers are created. The 16th Amendment, that was from Stanton v. Baltic Mining, I said. The 16th Amendment, although referred to in argument, has no real bearing and may be put out of view. As pointed out in recent decisions, it does not extend the taxing power to new or accepted subjects, which citizens were before the 16th Amendment, accepted subjects, but merely removes all occasion which otherwise might exist for an apportionment among the states of taxes laid on income, whether it be derived from one source or another, citing Bruce Shaver, Stanton v. Baltic Mining, and Peck and Company v. Lowe. Next, moreover, in addition, the conclusion reached in the Pollock case did not in any degree involve holding that income taxes generically and necessarily came within the class of direct taxes on property, but on the contrary, recognized the fact that taxation on income was in its nature an excise and entitled to be enforced as such unless and until it was concluded that to enforce it would amount to accomplishing the result which the requirement as to apportionment of direct taxation was adopted to prevent, in which case the duty would arise to disregard form and consider substance alone, and hence subject the tax to the regulation to apportionment, which otherwise as an excise would not apply to it. That's from Bruce Shaver explaining it's not a direct tax, it's indirect. And they further explain that if its indirect application ever becomes so direct, that would require apportionment. And that's exactly what we've been living with since the end of World War II. A direct tax on earnings that was never apportioned. Even though it's authorized as an indirect tax, the court says right here in 1913, if its application becomes oppressive, it would be subject to apportionment, even though it's supposedly labeled indirect. It wouldn't be, because of the way it was applied, as in to labor and everything you did every time you made money. It's unconstitutional. It always has been. It's been a fraud, a socialist left fraud. We'll go on. The various propositions are so intermingled as to cause it to be difficult to classify them. We are of opinion, however, that the confusion is not inherent, but rather arises from the conclusion that the 16th Amendment provides for a hitherto unknown power of taxation. That is, a power to levy an income tax which, although direct, should not be subject to the regulation of apportionment applicable to all other direct taxes. And the far-reaching effect of this erroneous assumption will be made clear by generalizing the many contentions advanced in argument to support it. Yeah, advanced erroneously. This is from Bruce Shaver, where the court is rejecting the argued direct application of the tax. Let's go on. But it clearly results that the proposition and the contentions under it, if acceded to, would cause one provision of the Constitution to destroy another. That is, they would result in bringing the provisions of the amendment exempting a direct tax from apportionment into irreconcilable conflict with the general requirement that all direct taxes be apportioned. Moreover, the tax authorized by the amendment, being direct, would not come under the rule of uniformity applicable under the Constitution to other than direct taxes, and thus it would come to pass that the result of the amendment would be to authorize a particular direct tax not subject either to apportionment or to the rule of geographical uniformity, thus giving power to impose a different tax in one state or states than was levied in another state or states. This result, instead of simplifying the situation and making clear the limitations on the taxing powers, which obviously the amendment must have been intended to accomplish, would create radical and destructive changes in our constitutional system and multiply confusion. This is from page 12 of the Bruce Shaver decision in 1913. Boy, did they see it coming, huh? Radical and destructive changes from uniform taxation of the citizens to bracketed class warfare under an income tax that's graduated and enforced on citizens in a non-uniform manner. Did they see it coming or what? Radical and destructive changes that would multiply confusion. And that's where we are today, under a fraudulent tax enforcement system. 100% fraudulent. We go on. Duties and imposts are terms commonly applied to levies made by governments on the importation or exportation of commodities. Excises are taxes laid upon the manufacture, sale, or consumption of commodities within the country, upon licenses to pursue certain occupations, and upon corporate privileges. The requirement to pay such taxes involves the exercise of the privilege, and if business is not done in the manner described, no tax is payable. It is the privilege which is the subject of the tax and not the mere buying, selling, or handling of goods. Again, this is from Flint v. Stone Tracy, which predates the 16th Amendment by 2 years, 1911. Imposts and duties tax foreign imports and exports. Excises tax commodities, licenses, and corporations. So where's the tax on labor? That's indirect under Article 1, Section 8, which the court says that's what the income tax is. So where's the tax on labor? It's not an impost, it's not a duty, it's not an excise, unless you're talking about the labor of a foreign person, subject to the impost in the Tariff Act of 1913. But where's the tax on the labor of American citizens working in the 50 states? It doesn't exist in the Constitution. That's why they've had to lie to you about the 16th Amendment. And here, evidently, Congress adopted the income as the measure of the tax to be imposed with respect to the doing of business in corporate form, because it desired that the excise should be imposed, approximately at least, with regard to the amount of benefit presumably derived by such corporations from the current operations of the government. It cites Flint v. Stone Tracy and goes on. It was held that Congress, in exercising the right to tax a legitimate subject of taxation as a franchise or privilege, was not debarred by the Constitution from measuring the taxation by the total income, although derived in part from property which, considered by itself, was not taxable. It was reasonable that Congress should fix upon gross income, without distinction as to source, as a convenient and sufficiently accurate index of the importance of the business transacted, and then how much tax rate it would be subjected to. This is Stratton's Independence Limited v. Halbert from 1913. Okay, so all of these original decisions take us back to what the court said. It's not direct, it's indirect, it only applies to corporations. As repeatedly held, this did not extend the taxing power to new subjects, like citizens, but merely removed the necessity which otherwise might exist for an apportionment among the states of taxes laid on income. Cites Bruce Shaber, Stanton v. Baltic Mining, Peck and Company v. Lowe, and this is from Eisner v. Macomber. And now we go on. Whether the taxes be classified as an excise is in truth not of critical importance. If not that, it is an impost, citing Pollock, Pacific Insurance, or a duty, citing VZ Bank, Knowlton v. Moore. A capitation or other direct tax? It certainly is not. And this is 1937 in Stewart Machine Company versus Collector. Okay, so it's always been indirect. It's never been direct. The courts and the government have no authority to enforce a direct, non-apportioned tax on income under the 16th Amendment against the individual American people. A court may not render a judgment which transcends the limits of its authority, and a judgment is void if it is beyond the powers granted to the court by the law of its organization, even where the court has jurisdiction over the parties and the subject matter. Thus, if a court is authorized by statute to entertain jurisdiction in a particular case only, like enforcing indirect taxes against people, and undertakes to exercise the jurisdiction conferred in a case to which the statute has no application, like the enforcement of a direct tax, the judgment rendered is void. The lack of statutory authority to make a particular order or a judgment is akin to lack of subject matter jurisdiction and is subject to collateral attack. It doesn't exist. We admit, as all must admit, that the powers of the government are limited and its limits are not to be transcended. This is McCulloch v. State of Maryland, but we don't have time to finish that. This is Thomas Freed. I think I hear the end of the show coming up. Get on over to taxfreedom.com. Start reading. Get educated. If you need help, it's at irszoom.com. And again, we need your help at the Liberty Works Radio Network. Please find your way over to our website and get signed up as a subscribing member. Okay, very good. Stop recording.